It started like any other morning on my farmhouse, peaceful, quiet, and simple. I had just finished my coffee when I noticed something strange. The small wooden coop near the edge of my property stood open. At first, I thought I had forgotten to latch it properly, but when I walked closer, my heart sank. My favorite hen, Daisy, was missing. Daisy wasn't just any hen. I had raised her since she was a chick, and she was the kind of bird you couldn't help but love. She followed me around like a loyal dog, clucking happily as I worked on the farm. For months, she had been laying the best golden-yolked eggs, something I took pride in. But now, she was gone, and as I scanned the property for any signs of her, a sinking feeling crept over me. This wasn't an accident. Someone had taken her. At first, I thought maybe it was a fox or a raccoon, but there were no signs of a struggle. The latch hadn't been broken, the fencing was intact, and there were no feathers scattered around. It was too clean, too deliberate. And when I spotted fresh tire tracks leading away from my property, a detail I had never noticed before, my suspicion turned toward the HOA. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry homeowners association, you already know how far they'll go to enforce their rules. And my HOA, they were on a whole different level of crazy. They had harassed me over everything: my garden, my fence height, even the color of my mailbox. But lately, they had set their sights on my farmhouse animals. A few weeks earlier, I had received a formal notice. Farm animals are not permitted within the Crestview HOA community unless otherwise approved by the board. Failure to comply will result in fines and possible property penalties. I'd laughed it off. My farmhouse predated the HOA by 20 years. The rules didn't apply to me, and I wasn't about to give up the small joys of my rural life, but I should have known they weren't going to let it slide. I decided to confront the HOA directly. I marched straight to their office, barely holding back my anger as I demanded to speak to the head of the board. And of course, there she was, Karen. If you've ever imagined the perfect HOA tyrant, she was it. Platinum blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, and a permanent scowl that made you feel like you were always breaking a rule, even when you weren't. She thrived on controlling everything and had made it her personal mission to clean up the neighborhood, one property at a time. "Ah, Mr. Walker," she said, leaning back in her leather chair. "What a surprise. How can I help you?" I didn't waste time with small talk. "Where's my hen, Karen?" For a moment, she pretended to be confused, playing innocent like she always did, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew exactly what I was talking about. "Your hen?" she said, tilting her head. "If you're referring to that animal violating our community guidelines, it's been relocated." Relocated? As if Daisy were a piece of misplaced furniture. My blood boiled. "You had no right. My property isn't under HOA jurisdiction. I have every legal right to keep livestock." She smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "Well, Mr. Walker, your precious little farm is an eyesore, and let me remind you, the HOA is committed to maintaining property values. If that means removing unsanctioned animals, so be it." I knew arguing with her wouldn't get me anywhere, but I wasn't about to let her win. I needed proof. And if the HOA had taken Daisy, they would have left a trail. That night, I set up security cameras around my property. If they came back, I would catch them red-handed. But my biggest break came from an unexpected source. My neighbor, Mrs. Collins. She was a kind-hearted widow who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. And unlike most residents, she wasn't afraid of the HOA. When I mentioned what happened, she lowered her voice and said, "I saw them, you know. They took her late last night. 2 men in an HOA truck. They went toward the old storage shed near the community center." That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, I drove to the community center, keeping an eye on the maintenance shed tucked behind it. The door was padlocked, but the lock was new, and curiosity got the better of me. I knew breaking in would only give the HOA more leverage, so instead, I decided to use an old trick. I placed a small Bluetooth camera inside a vent near the door. If Daisy was in there, I'd have footage. Hours later, I checked the camera feed, and there she was, my Daisy, clucking away inside a crate. They had taken her and locked her up like a criminal, but instead of rushing in, I played the long game. I gathered every piece of evidence: security footage, witness testimony, even the threatening letters from the HOA, and I sent it all to my lawyer. Within days, a formal cease and desist letter was on Karen's desk, demanding Daisy's return and threatening legal action for trespassing and theft. It turns out the HOA may have power, but they aren't above the law. Faced with a lawsuit and bad press brewing in the local news, they caved. That weekend, under the watchful eyes of my lawyer and a few neighbors, Daisy was returned, healthy, safe, and clucking louder than ever. And Karen, she wasn't smiling anymore. But I didn't stop there. With the community now aware of their overreach, we organized and voted to overhaul the HOA. New leadership, new rules, and a permanent ban on Karen ever holding power again. As for Daisy, she's still roaming the farmhouse, a little wiser, but just as feisty. And now, every morning when she lays an egg, it feels like a small victory, a reminder that no matter how powerful the HOA thinks they are, they'll never mess with me or my hen again. And if they try, well, let's just say I'm always watching. In the days after Daisy's triumphant return, you might think the HOA would back off, but you'd be wrong. Karen may have been publicly humiliated, but if there was one thing I knew about her, it was this. She didn't lose quietly, and sure enough, just when I thought things had settled down, the HOA struck again, this time with a plan even more underhanded than before. It all started with a letter, not the usual passive-aggressive HOA notice. I was used to those. No, this one came from the county zoning board. According to the letter, a formal complaint had been filed against my property, citing zoning violations related to unauthorized livestock and agricultural activities. In other words, someone, I wonder who, was trying to shut down my farmhouse entirely. I knew the complaint wasn't legitimate. My property had been zoned for agricultural use long before the HOA even existed. But that didn't stop Karen from using every bureaucratic loophole she could find to make my life miserable. If the county sided with her, I could lose more than just Daisy. I could lose everything. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Until then, I had a choice: play defense or go on the attack. I chose the latter. If Karen wanted to escalate this war, I was ready to meet her head-on. The first thing I did was dig deeper into Karen's past. People like her don't just wake up one day and decide to become petty tyrants. There's always a trail, and with a little help from some tech-savvy friends, I found it. Turns out, before she moved to our neighborhood, Karen had been the president of another HOA, one that no longer existed. Why? Because it had been disbanded after a class action lawsuit exposed massive financial fraud. She had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars through community improvement projects, using HOA funds to pay for her lavish lifestyle. When the homeowners found out, they sued. She lost everything: her position, her reputation, and almost her home. And now she was doing the same thing here. With that bombshell in my back pocket, I decided to gather even more ammunition. I started attending every HOA meeting, recording everything, taking notes, and talking to other homeowners. And the more I listened, the more I realized that I wasn't the only one she had targeted. One neighbor, Mr. Lopez, had been fined over $2,000 for planting roses because Karen claimed they weren't an approved flower. Another, the Johnsons, had received a notice threatening foreclosure because their front door was the wrong shade of blue. And it wasn't just petty fines. Karen had been quietly raising HOA fees every year with no public vote and no explanation of where the extra money was going. It was a pattern, a scam, and I was going to expose it. By the time the zoning hearing rolled around, I was ready. Karen, of course, showed up dressed like she was queen of the neighborhood, flanked by her usual group of loyal board members. She was all smiles until she realized that half the community had shown up to support me. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I laid out everything: the bogus complaints, the trespassing, the stolen hen, and now the blatant attempt to use county resources to enforce her personal vendetta. But I didn't stop there. I presented documents linking her to questionable financial activity, including invoices for community improvements that never happened. And then, for the grand finale, I revealed her fraudulent past. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The county officials were furious at being manipulated, and within minutes the zoning complaint was dismissed. But the real damage wasn't to me, it was to Karen. The hearing sparked an official audit of the HOA's finances, and what the auditors uncovered made her old fraud case look like child's play. Over $50,000 had mysteriously disappeared from community funds, much of it redirected to a private account linked to Karen's name. She had been using HOA money to pay for everything: luxury vacations, home renovations, even a brand new SUV. When the audit results became public, the fallout was swift. Karen was removed from the HOA board in disgrace, and legal action followed. By the time the dust settled, she faced multiple felony charges for embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of community funds. And the best part, she wasn't just kicked off the board, she was forced to sell her home to repay the stolen money. And just like that, the reign of HOA Queen Karen was over. With her gone, the community united to rewrite the HOA bylaws, limiting board power and ensuring that no one could ever pull the kind of stunts Karen had again. We instituted term limits, transparent financial reporting, and even a homeowners oversight committee to prevent any future abuse. And as for me, well, Daisy still struts around the farmhouse, clucking louder than ever, a little feathered symbol of victory. I keep a framed copy of that zoning complaint in my office, not as a reminder of the fight, but as a warning to anyone who thinks they can push people around. If you come for me or my hen, you better be ready for war, because I don't back down, and I never lose. With Karen out of the picture and the HOA finally under control, you'd think that life on my farmhouse would return to its quiet, peaceful rhythm. And for a while, it did. Daisy strutted around like she owned the place. My garden flourished, and the endless string of HOA threats became nothing but a distant memory. But here's the thing about power-hungry people. They never stay gone for long. It started subtly, small things. Random inspections by new HOA board members, suspicious cars lingering near my property, and, most annoying of all, my mailbox mysteriously disappearing. Twice. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Karen's fingerprints were all over it. Sure, she had been ousted, humiliated, and legally crushed, but people like her, they never let go of a grudge. And while the law had stripped her of her title, her influence still lingered. Through a network of former allies and loyal puppets, she was working behind the scenes, plotting her comeback, and this time she was playing for revenge. I knew I couldn't let my guard down, so I did what any sensible person would do. I prepared for battle. I upgraded my security system, added motion-triggered cameras, and even installed hidden microphones near the property's entry points. If they so much as breathed on my land, I'd know. It wasn't long before my caution paid off. One morning, just before dawn, I got an alert. Movement detected near the chicken coop. My heart pounded as I pulled up the live feed on my phone, and there they were, two masked figures sneaking around the property. At first, I thought they were vandals, or maybe petty thieves. But then, one of them turned toward the camera, and even with the mask, I recognized that smug posture anywhere. Karen. The fact that she was dumb enough to return to the scene of her former crimes only confirmed one thing. She wanted me to know this wasn't about Daisy or the coop or the HOA bylaws. This was personal. But if she thought I was going to sit back and let her win, she had seriously underestimated me. I didn't call the police. Not yet. No, I wanted to catch her red-handed. So I silently activated my backup cameras, ensuring I had footage from every angle. Then I waited, and sure enough, I didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, they broke the lock on my coop and snatched Daisy again. But this time, they weren't getting away with it. I followed them, carefully, quietly. I trailed their car as they drove to a familiar spot, the abandoned maintenance shed behind the old community center. Apparently, Karen hadn't learned her lesson about hiding stolen property. I parked a safe distance away and slipped closer on foot. My hidden mic picked up every word of their conversation. This time, he won't get her back, Karen hissed. I'm done letting him humiliate me. Let's see how smug he is when his precious hen disappears for good. I had heard enough. With a few taps on my phone, I sent the live footage directly to my lawyer and to local law enforcement. Within 15 minutes, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Karen's expression when they caught her with the stolen chicken in her arms, priceless. Of course, she tried to talk her way out of it, playing the victim, blaming the corrupt HOA board, even accusing me of harassment. But the evidence was airtight. Between the security footage, the audio recordings, and her fingerprints on the broken lock, there was no escape. This time, Karen was arrested on the spot, charged with trespassing, theft, and criminal harassment. And since this wasn't her first legal run-in, the judge had zero sympathy. Her bail was set high, and while she sat in county lockup, I took one final step to ensure she would never bother me or anyone else again. I worked with my lawyer to file a restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of my property, and just for good measure, we pushed the HOA to permanently ban her from any future involvement. When all was said and done, the damage to her reputation was irreparable. Whatever power she once held was gone for good. And me, I'm still here. My farmhouse is safer than ever, and Daisy, my feisty little hen, is back where she belongs, happily clucking away. But let's be clear, if Karen or anyone else ever dares to come after me again, they'd better be ready for a fight they can't win. Because in the end, no matter how many tricks they pull, no one messes with me and my hen and gets away with it. After Karen's arrest and the restraining order in place, I finally felt a sense of peace returning to my farmhouse. The constant stress of her antics had weighed on me for far too long. Now, with the HOA under new leadership and Karen legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of my property, I thought the chaos was over. But as it turns out, people like Karen don't give up. They just get more creative. A few months later, strange things started happening again. At first, it was small stuff. My mail began arriving late or not at all. Packages went missing. I even caught a stranger poking around my garden late one night, though they ran off before I could confront them. The real kicker, Daisy, my stubborn little hen, stopped laying eggs, a clear sign of stress. I knew these weren't random coincidences. Karen may have been banned from my property, but her influence still lingered, and I was determined to find out exactly how far her reach extended. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I started digging. I began attending HOA meetings again, listening carefully for any hint of her meddling. Most of the new board members seemed genuinely committed to undoing her damage, except one, a man named Richard. He had joined the board shortly after Karen's downfall and seemed far too invested in protecting her legacy. Anytime someone mentioned Karen's misdeeds, he would shift the conversation, deflecting blame or downplaying her crimes. It was subtle, but I recognized the game. I wasn't about to let him get away with it. Late one night, I started researching Richard. A few hours of digging, and I hit the jackpot. Turns out, he wasn't just a concerned homeowner, he was Karen's cousin, and if the shady financial records I uncovered were accurate, he had received thousands of dollars in consulting fees from the HOA's mysterious discretionary fund, money Karen had approved before her downfall. In other words, he was still working for her. With that evidence in hand, I knew I needed to play this smart. Karen had already tried to ruin my life once. I wasn't going to let her or her puppet do it again. So I devised a plan. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd beat them at their own game. Step one was gathering proof. I started recording every suspicious encounter, mysterious cars near my property, the tampered mail, and even a break-in attempt on my barn that I caught on one of my motion-activated cameras. Sure enough, the figure who tried to pry open the barn door looked an awful lot like Richard. Step two, expose them publicly. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in with a folder full of evidence, dates, photos, security footage, even the financial records connecting Richard to Karen's old schemes. I waited patiently while the board handled their usual dull agenda until the community concerns portion of the meeting arrived, and then I let it all out. I presented the evidence piece by piece, explaining how the harassment hadn't stopped with Karen's arrest, the stolen mail, the garden trespasser, and the break-in attempt. It was all linked back to Richard. When I revealed his family connection to Karen and the money he had received, the room erupted. The board members were horrified, and the homeowners, they were furious. No one wanted a repeat of Karen's reign of terror, and the fact that her influence still lingered felt like a betrayal. Within minutes, a motion to remove Richard from the board was on the table and passed unanimously. But I didn't stop there. I filed a formal complaint with the local post office about my missing mail, handing over my video evidence. And when the sheriff's office reviewed the footage of Richard trying to break into my barn, let's just say they were more than happy to pay him a little visit. Within a week, Richard was not only off the HOA board, but facing criminal charges for trespassing, attempted theft, and mail tampering, serious federal offenses. And the best part, his actions violated the terms of Karen's restraining order, which meant she was pulled back into court to answer for her continued harassment. By the time the dust settled, Karen's last supporter was gone, her legal troubles had doubled, and she had no power left to torment anyone. And me, I finally had my peace back. The farmhouse returned to its quiet, peaceful routine. My mail arrived on time, the garden flourished again, and best of all, Daisy returned to her normal egg-laying self. But just in case anyone else got any bright ideas, I left the new HOA board with one final message. If you come for me or my hen, be ready for a fight you will never win. And trust me, they got the message.